The shaking started before the alarms did. I felt it in my chest first, a low tremor that climbed up through the floor of the command deck and into my bones. Then the lights flickered red, and every screen in front of me lit up with the same word, over and over. Breach, breach, breach. My name is Celine Ardovi, and I was the one who sent the signal that changed everything. I did not know that yet. In that moment, I only knew that the shields around my homeworld were failing, and that the ships coming toward us did not knock before they arrived. The Skarn Dominion had been hunting us for 3 long cycles. They did not want our land. They did not want our resources. They wanted us gone, quietly, so that no one would ever ask what happened to the Vaeltiri people. We had built cities that sang with light. We had written music that made grown elders weep. We had never built a weapon meant to kill another living being, because we never believed we would need one. That belief cost us everything. I stood at my station, watching numbers fall. Our outer colonies were already gone. Millions of my people turned to drifting debris in the space between stars. The Dominion did not send warnings. They sent silence, and then they sent fire. Councilwoman Thessaly stood behind me, her hands pressed flat against the console, her 4 fingers trembling. She was the oldest member of our council, old enough to remember a time before the war, when our biggest concern was whether the Eastern Gardens would bloom on schedule. Now she looked at a screen full of enemy ships and said nothing at all, because there was nothing left to say. "How long?" she finally asked. "Until they reach the capital shield." I did not want to answer her. The numbers on my screen made my throat tighten. 6 hours, I said. Maybe less, if they push their engines. She closed her eyes. 6 hours was nothing. 6 hours was the length of a single afternoon nap, the length of a walk through the old market streets, the length of time it took to watch 2 suns set from the western towers. 6 hours was supposed to be small and forgettable. Now it was the entire length of what remained of our world. I had spent every day of the last year sending messages into the dark, distress calls to every alliance we had ever known, every trade partner, every neutral system that might have a fleet large enough to matter. Every single one came back the same way. Silence, or worse, polite refusal. No one wanted to stand between the Dominion and their next target. No one wanted to become the next name on that list. We had one card left to play, and it was not a card anyone wanted to touch. Long before I was born, back when our historians still spoke openly about the wider galaxy, there had been a survey team sent to a small blue world on the edge of known space. The report they brought back was sealed the day it arrived, and every copy after that was locked away under the highest restriction our archives could hold. I had only heard whispers about it as a child, a world too dangerous to approach, a species too unpredictable to trust. The word used most often in the sealed files, according to rumor, was feral. That word had frightened generations of my people into silence. No one contacted that world. No one even sent probes near it. It was marked on every star chart with a single warning symbol and nothing else. Now Councilwoman Thessaly turned to me, and I understood, before she said a single word, exactly what she wanted. "Send it," she said. "Send the old beacon." "That signal has not been used in centuries," I said. My hands were already moving toward the console, because some part of me had known this moment was coming long before she asked. "We do not even know if anyone still listens on that frequency." "It does not matter," she said. "We have nothing else." I looked at the sealed authorization sitting untouched in our system for longer than my own lifetime. My fingers hovered over it. Somewhere above us, kilometers away, the first wave of Dominion ships had already begun forming their attack pattern. I could see them on the long-range scanners, dark shapes sliding into position like teeth closing around something small and soft. I broke the seal. The old beacon frequency woke up on my screen for the first time in longer than any living person could remember. It felt strange to touch something so old, something my ancestors had locked away out of fear rather than hope. I typed the message myself, because there was no time to draft it through the usual channels, no time for careful diplomatic language chosen by a committee of advisors who were, at this very moment, arguing uselessly in another room about whether this was even legal. I wrote it plainly. I wrote it the way I would speak to another living person standing in front of me, frightened and out of options. We are the Veiltiri. Our homeworld is under attack. Our shields will fail within hours. We have sent this signal to every system we know, and none have answered. We do not know if you will listen. We do not know if you even exist anymore. But we are asking anyway, because we are out of anything else to try. If there is anyone who receives this message, we are begging for help. I sent it before I could think better of it. The beacon pulsed once, twice, then vanished into the dark, at speeds far beyond anything our own ships could manage. It would take time to reach its destination, if it reached anything at all. Thessaly placed her hand on my shoulder. Her grip was light but firm, the kind of touch meant to steady someone who might otherwise fall. "You did the right thing," she said. "I do not even know what I just did," I told her honestly. "I do not know what waits on that world. No one alive has seen it." "Then we wait," she said, "and we hope whatever answers is kinder than what is already coming." I turned back to my screen. The Dominion fleet had grown larger in the short time since I had sent the message. Their formation was tightening, an efficient, practiced motion, the kind of thing an army does when it has done this so many times that it no longer requires thought. They were not rushing. They did not need to rush. They knew, the same as we did, that our shields could not hold. Around me, the command deck filled with quiet sounds of people trying to stay calm. A young technician near the far wall kept whispering numbers to herself, running calculations that would not change the outcome no matter how many times she checked them. An older officer stood very still at the door, staring at nothing, his mind clearly somewhere else entirely, perhaps with family members already evacuated to shelters that would not survive an actual attack. I thought about my own family in that moment. My younger sibling, still finishing schooling in the Southern District, probably unaware that the entire fate of our world now rested on a message sent into empty space toward a planet no living Veiltiri had ever visited. Hours passed slower than I thought possible. The shield strength dropped steadily, a number I watched more closely than I watched my own heartbeat. 90%, 80%. The Dominion fleet grew close enough that we no longer needed sensors to see them. We could see their ships directly through the observation windows, dark specks against the stars, multiplying every time I dared to look away and back again. 70% shield strength. I heard someone behind me begin to quietly weep. No one told them to stop. I kept my eyes on the old beacon frequency, though I knew it was foolish. Nothing would answer that quickly. The signal itself would take time simply to cross the distance, and any response, if one ever came, would take just as long to return. I was watching an empty channel out of nothing but desperate habit, the same way a person watches a closed door long after they know no one is coming through it. 60% shield strength. Thessaly gripped the edge of her console so tightly her knuckles paled. "Celine," she said quietly, "if this does not work, I want you to know that sending that signal was still the correct choice. Fear kept our ancestors from ever reaching out to that world. Fear is not a good enough reason to let our people disappear without trying everything we had left." I nodded, though I could not speak. My throat felt too tight for words. 50% shield strength. The Dominion ships began to slow, taking up their final positions, the same formation I had watched them use in recordings from other worlds, worlds that no longer existed by the time those recordings reached us. There was a horrible efficiency to it, the calm patience of something that has never once failed to get what it wants. I stared at that formation and felt something inside me go very quiet and very still, the kind of stillness that comes right before a person accepts something they cannot change. And then, on a screen I had almost stopped watching, a single light blinked. It was faint at first, easy to dismiss as a sensor error, the kind of small glitch that happens 100 times a day on any working console. But it did not disappear. It grew steadier, brighter, until I realized with a jolt that ran straight through my entire body that it was not an error at all. Something had entered the system. It was not Dominion. It was not registered in any database our ships carried, not a single design feature matching anything cataloged in centuries of records. It was small, almost absurdly small compared to the Dominion fleet gathering above us, and for one terrible heartbeat I believed it was nothing more than a lost trading vessel that had wandered into the worst possible place at the worst possible time. Then it moved. It moved in a way no drifting, lost, or frightened ship ever moves. It moved with purpose, cutting straight toward the heart of the Dominion formation, as though it had been waiting its entire existence for exactly this moment. Thessaly's hand tightened on my shoulder. Neither of us breathed. "Celine," she whispered, "what is that?" I looked at the tiny, strange shape sliding directly into the teeth of the largest fleet either of us had ever seen, and for the first time since the alarms began, I felt something other than fear. I did not yet know its name. I did not yet know what it was capable of, or what it would cost, or what truth it carried about the very people who had sent it. All I knew, standing there with my hand still hovering over the ancient beacon that had somehow, impossibly, worked, was that we were no longer alone. Something had answered. The small ship did not slow down as it approached the Dominion fleet. It did not send a greeting. It did not ask for permission. It simply opened fire. I watched it happen on the main screen, and for a moment my mind refused to accept what my eyes were showing me. The weapons this ship used were nothing like the elegant energy beams the Dominion favored, nothing like the clean, silent destruction we had grown used to seeing from a safe distance. These were raw, physical, almost primitive in their simplicity, yet they tore through Dominion shielding as though that shielding barely existed at all. "That is impossible," said the young technician near the far wall, her voice cracking. "Their shields should hold against something that small." They did not hold. One Dominion escort vessel spun away from the formation, trailing smoke and debris. Its outer hull ruptured in a dozen places. Another tried to break formation entirely, engines flaring in a clear attempt to flee, and the small strange ship simply turned and followed it, relentless, until it too went dark and drifting. Thessaly stood frozen beside me, her mouth slightly open. In all her long life, she had never once seen a Dominion vessel retreat from anything. "Get me a channel," she said finally, her voice regaining some of its old authority. "I want to know who is flying that ship before they decide we are also a target." I worked quickly, running every frequency I could think of, searching for any signal the strange vessel might be broadcasting. It took longer than I expected, because whatever communication system it used did not match any protocol in our records. Finally, buried beneath layers of static, I found something, a voice. It spoke our language, though badly, with strange pauses in odd places, and words stretched out longer than they should have been. It was clearly not a native speaker, and yet the message was unmistakable. "This is the independent vessel wandering home, responding to a distress signal received on old frequency designation 731. We read your beacon. Sorry it took a while. That channel does not get much traffic these days. Looks like you folks could use some help." I stared at the screen, unable to fully process what I had just heard. The voice belonged to a man, his tone strangely casual given the chaos unfolding around him, almost as if he were commenting on ordinary weather rather than active combat against an empire that had never lost a war. "Cavalry's a little late," the voice continued, "but we brought friends." As if summoned by his own words, 3 more shapes appeared on our long-range scanners, translating into the system from directions our sensors had not even been monitoring. None of them matched each other in design. One looked like a heavily modified mining vessel, its hull scarred and patched with mismatched plating. Another appeared to be an old warship of a design our historical archives did not recognize, clearly decades out of date yet somehow still functioning. The third was strangest of all, a bulky transport vessel with what looked like weapons crudely welded onto its exterior, as though someone had simply attached whatever they could find to whatever they had available. "Thessaly," I said quietly, "I do not think that is a proper military fleet." "No," she agreed, her voice equally quiet. "It is not." And yet these mismatched, strange vessels moved into the battle with the same reckless confidence as the first ship, each one finding a target and engaging without hesitation, without the careful coordination we expected from any organized force. It should have looked like chaos. It should have looked like a disaster waiting to happen. Instead, it looked like something far more unsettling. It looked like every single pilot in that small, ragged fleet knew exactly what they were doing and simply did not care that their methods looked nothing like proper warfare. The Dominion commander, a being named Vos Karvan, whose voice I had heard broadcast across dozens of conquered worlds boasting about inevitable victory, finally opened a channel of his own. His voice carried the same cold confidence it always did, though I thought I detected the smallest crack beneath it now. "Unknown vessels," he said, "you are interfering with a sanctioned military operation. Withdraw immediately or be destroyed." There was a pause, then the same casual voice from before responded, and I swore I could hear something like amusement in it. "Sanctioned by who exactly? Because from where I am sitting, it looks like you are just shooting at people who cannot shoot back. That is not really a military operation where I come from. That is just being a bully with better toys." Karvan's response came sharp and immediate. "You are outnumbered 11 to 1. Surrender your vessels, and your crews will be spared." "Funny," the voice replied. "We were about to offer you the exact same deal." The battle that followed did not resemble anything in our historical records. Dominion tactics relied on precision, coordination, and overwhelming numbers used with cold efficiency. These new arrivals ignored every rule of engagement we thought we understood. They flew directly into danger rather than around it. They took hits that should have crippled their vessels and kept fighting anyway. When one of the mismatched ships lost an engine entirely, drifting and clearly vulnerable, I expected it to retreat or be destroyed within moments. Instead, two other vessels immediately broke formation to shield it, taking damage meant for their wounded companion, buying it time to make emergency repairs mid-battle. I had never seen anything like it. Our own military doctrine, limited as it was, taught that a damaged vessel should withdraw to protect the rest of the fleet. These pilots seemed to operate on the opposite principle entirely. No one gets left behind, no matter the cost to those still able to fight. Thessaly grabbed my arm as another Dominion vessel exploded into fragments. "Celine, look at their formation. They do not have one. They are just reacting, adapting. How is that working against an enemy this large?" I did not have an answer for her. I only had the numbers scrolling across my screen, numbers that made no logical sense given everything we understood about warfare. The Dominion fleet, which had approached our world with the calm certainty of something that had never once failed, was losing ships faster than I could track them. An hour into the engagement, Karvan's fleet had lost nearly a third of its strength. I watched his flagship attempt to reposition, clearly recalculating a battle plan that had never accounted for whatever these new arrivals represented. His voice returned to the open channel, and this time the crack in his confidence was impossible to miss. "What are you?" he demanded. "What species sends this few ships against an entire invasion fleet?" The reply came without hesitation, almost cheerful in its delivery. "The kind that got asked nicely to help and figured showing up was better than staying home." I turned to Thessaly, my mind racing with questions I could not begin to answer. "Do we know anything about them? Any records? Any historical files? Anything at all?" She shook her head slowly. "Only rumors. Old warnings passed down that were never explained. A world marked dangerous and left alone." She paused, watching the battle unfold on the screen before us. "I am beginning to think our ancestors were not wrong to be afraid. I am only now understanding that being afraid of them was never the same as needing to avoid them." As the battle raged on, I managed to establish a direct channel to the vessel that had first arrived, the one calling itself Wandering Home. The voice that answered belonged to a woman this time, calm and steady despite the chaos surrounding her. "This is Grace Whitfield, second in command aboard Wandering Home," she said. "I understand you have questions. Most people do, the first time they meet us. We will answer what we can once this fleet stops trying to turn your planet into a debris field. For now, focus on getting your shield stable. We have this handled." "You are heavily outnumbered," I said, unable to stop myself. How can you possibly believe you have this handled? There was a brief pause, and when Grace spoke again, her voice carried something I had not expected. Not arrogance, not boastfulness, but something closer to simple, tired patience. The voice of someone who had explained this many times before and would likely need to explain it many more times in the future. Numbers only matter to people who fight the way everyone expects them to, she said. We stopped fighting that way a long time ago. Your enemy calculates acceptable losses. We do not really believe in that idea. It tends to make us harder to predict and considerably harder to stop. The channel closed before I could ask anything further. I sat back in my chair, watching the battle continue to unfold in ways that defied everything I understood about strategy, about the careful mathematics of conflict that every civilized species supposedly followed. Carvan's flagship, the largest and most heavily armored vessel in the entire Dominion formation, began to pull back from the main engagement, clearly seeking to regroup and reassess. It was the first time in the entire recorded history of the Dominion's campaign against our people that one of their commanders had ordered a retreat rather than pressing forward regardless of cost. I watched the small, strange fleet press their advantage without hesitation, fighting like something that had nothing left to prove and everything left to finish. Thessaly finally released her grip on my arm, though her hand was shaking as she lowered it. "Celine," she said softly, "I do not think we asked for saviors." "Then what did we ask for?" I said, though some part of me already suspected the answer. She looked at the screen, at the wreckage of Dominion ships scattered like broken toys against the dark backdrop of space, at the strange mismatched fleet cutting through an army that had never known defeat. "I think," she said slowly, "we asked for something the rest of the galaxy has spent a very long time trying to forget existed at all." Below us, on the surface of our capital city, warning systems that had been signaling imminent destruction only hours earlier began, very slowly, to fall silent. People who had been sheltering in fear, certain their world was ending, began to step outside and look up at a sky filled with fire that no longer threatened them. I did not yet understand what we had brought into our system. I did not yet know the full truth of who these people were, or why a species capable of turning the tide of an unwinnable war had been left alone and unknown at the edge of the galaxy for so many generations. All I knew, watching Carvan's retreating fleet limp away from our world for the very first time since this war began, was that the beings who answered our call were nothing like what the old warnings had led us to fear. They were something far more complicated than that. And I was about to find out exactly what that meant. The Dominion fleet retreated to the outer edge of our system, keeping a wary distance rather than withdrawing entirely. Carvan was regrouping, not surrendering, and every officer on our command deck understood the difference. The battle had paused, it had not ended. In that pause, something else began. The strange fleet that had arrived to save us requested permission to send a representative down to the surface, to speak directly with our council rather than through broken translations across static-filled channels. Thessaly agreed almost before I finished relaying the request, and within the hour, a small transport craft descended through our atmosphere and landed just outside the Capitol building. I was assigned to greet them, alongside two council guards who looked more nervous than I had ever seen them. None of us knew what to expect. The old warnings in our archives described a species capable of terrible things, yet the fleet we had just watched fight had done nothing but protect us. The transport door opened with a slow hiss, and the first human I ever saw in person stepped out into the pale afternoon light of our world. He was smaller than I expected, though still built solidly, with the kind of tiredness in his eyes that suggested he had not slept properly in longer than he cared to admit. He wore simple, practical clothing, nothing ornate or ceremonial, nothing that marked him as important beyond a small insignia stitched near his shoulder. He looked at me, then at the guards, then at the tall spires of our capital city rising behind us, and he smiled in a way that seemed genuinely warm despite everything happening around us. "Captain Daniel Cross," he said, extending a hand toward me in a gesture I did not immediately understand. "Wandering home. I take it you are the one who sent the beacon." "Celine Ardovi," I replied, uncertain what to do with his outstretched hand until he lowered it with an understanding nod, clearly used to first encounters going slightly awkward. "Yes, the message was mine." "Good work," he said simply. "Bad news travels slow out here, but that old frequency still reaches a few ears that matter. Lucky for you, one of them was ours." We walked together into the council chamber, where Thessaly and the remaining council members waited, along with several advisors, whose faces betrayed a mixture of gratitude and lingering fear. Daniel seemed to notice the fear immediately, though he said nothing about it at first, taking a seat when offered and waiting patiently while introductions were made. It was Thessaly who finally asked the question everyone in the room wanted answered. "Captain Cross," she said carefully, "our historical records contain warnings about your world, warnings that go back many generations, warnings sealed away and rarely discussed. I must ask you directly, why did the wider galaxy choose to isolate your people rather than welcome them?" Daniel's expression did not change, though something in his eyes grew distant, as if he were recalling something he had explained many times before to many different audiences. "That is a fair question," he said, "and I will give you an honest answer, because you deserve one, given everything your people have been through today." He leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the edge of the table. "A long time ago, before most of your people were even aware Earth existed, a survey team from somewhere out here made contact with us. They watched us for a while, studied our history, our conflicts, the way we treated each other, and the way we solved problems when things got difficult. What they found frightened them badly enough that they left without ever revealing themselves and filed a report recommending permanent isolation." "What did they find?" I asked quietly, though some part of me already suspected the shape of the answer. "They found a species that fights," Daniel said simply. "Not just against outside threats, but sometimes against itself. Our history is full of terrible chapters, wars fought over things that, looking back, seem small and foolish. We are not proud of all of it, but that survey team only looked at the worst parts of us and decided that was all we would ever be. They never stayed long enough to see the rest." "The rest," Thessaly repeated. "The part where, whenever something truly terrible happens, whenever people are in real danger, we do not sit back and calculate whether helping is worth the cost," Daniel said. "We just go. It is not always smart. It is not always safe, but it is who we are, and no committee sitting in judgment from a comfortable distance ever seemed interested in that part of the story." The room fell quiet for a long moment. I found myself studying Daniel's face, searching for any trace of the frightening creature the old records described, and finding instead someone who looked simply exhausted, the way anyone might look after fighting a battle that never should have been necessary in the first place. "So you were quarantined," Thessaly said slowly, "not because you were a threat to be conquered, but because you were considered too dangerous to allow contact with at all." "That is the short version," Daniel said. "The galaxy decided it was safer to lock the door and hope we never found the key ourselves. Funny thing about locked doors, though, eventually someone always finds a way to knock from the other side." "And you answered," I said. "We always answer," he said. "That is sort of the point people miss about us. They were so afraid of what we might do if provoked that nobody stopped to consider what we would do if simply asked." One of the council advisors, an older man named Fenric who had lost family members in the early days of the Dominion invasion, spoke up with obvious frustration in his voice. "Forgive me, Captain, but if your people are truly capable of turning back an entire invasion fleet with only a handful of ships, why has no one asked for your help before now? Surely other worlds have faced destruction. Surely other beacons have been sent." Daniel's expression grew serious, the warmth in his eyes replaced by something heavier. "That old beacon frequency was locked away by design, Fenric. Most species who learned about us were taught to fear us, not to trust us. Your beacon worked because somewhere in your archives, someone kept the frequency alive instead of erasing it entirely. Most worlds did not make that same choice. Most worlds preferred to face destruction alone rather than risk what they believed we might become. Tom. The weight of that statement settled over the room. I thought about all the failed distress calls we had sent to known allies, all the polite refusals, all the silence. And I thought about the ancient warning symbol marking Earth on every star chart, a symbol meant to protect the galaxy from something the galaxy itself had never truly understood. "How many of you are there?" Thessaly asked. "How large is your fleet, truly?" Daniel allowed himself a small, tired smile. "Smaller than you probably imagine. We are not an empire, Councilwoman. We do not command armies the size of the Dominion's forces. What we have is a loose collection of independent crews, scattered across a wide stretch of space, each one willing to answer a call for help when it reaches us. Wandering Home is one ship among many, and we happen to be close enough to respond first." "Then the fleet that arrived earlier," I said, "was not your full strength." "Not even close," he said. "But word travels fast among us, faster than you might expect for a species without your kind of centralized communication network. More ships are already on their way. It will take time for them to arrive, but they are coming." Fenric leaned back in his seat, processing this information with visible difficulty. "You are telling us that a handful of independent crews, without formal command structure, without a unified military doctrine, somehow managed to turn back a Dominion invasion fleet that has never once failed to conquer its target." "I am telling you exactly that," Daniel said. "And I understand how it sounds. Believe me, it confused plenty of people before you, people with far more military experience than anyone sitting in this room. The truth is, the Dominion built their entire strategy around fighting enemies who think and fight the way most of the galaxy does. Calculated risk, acceptable losses, orderly retreat when the numbers turn unfavorable. We do not fight that way, and it throws off every assumption their commanders rely on." "Is that not simply recklessness?" Fenric pressed. "Fighting without regard for losses seems less like strategy and more like desperation." Daniel considered the question carefully before answering, and when he spoke, his voice carried none of the casual humor from earlier. "There is a difference between recklessness and refusing to abandon people who need help. We lose ships, we lose people. It costs us plenty, more than most of the galaxy realizes, because we do not advertise our losses the way conquering empires advertise their victories. But every time we choose to help anyway, despite the cost, it tells your enemy something they were not prepared to hear. It tells them we are not going to behave the way their strategy assumes we will." Thessaly studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "And what do you want from us, Captain Cross? In exchange for this help, what price does your species ask?" For the first time since arriving, Daniel looked genuinely surprised by a question, as though it had not occurred to him that payment might be expected. "We do not really do this for a price, Councilwoman," he said. "You sent a call for help. We heard it. That is generally where the transaction ends for us. If your people want to offer friendship afterward, trade, alliance, whatever feels right to you, we will gladly discuss it. But we did not come here today expecting anything in return." Second one. The room fell silent again, though this silence felt different from the earlier one, less heavy with fear and more filled with something like disbelief. I watched the council members exchange glances, clearly struggling to reconcile this simple, almost casual generosity with the terrifying warnings that had shaped generations of our understanding about this species. "Captain," Thessaly finally said, "forgive me for asking so directly, but I must understand something. Your people were isolated by the wider galaxy out of fear. You have just risked your lives, and the lives of your crew, to save a world you had never before contacted, expecting nothing in return. Why would you do this for strangers, who by every account we possess, were taught to view your existence as a threat?" Daniel was quiet for a moment, looking out through the tall windows of the council chamber, toward the sky, where the wreckage of the battle still drifted, slowly being cleared by recovery teams from both our world and his. "Because somebody was screaming for help," he said finally, "and we have never really been very good at telling ourselves that it was not our problem. I do not think anyone in that room fully understood, in that moment, exactly what those words would come to mean for our people, or how deeply they would reshape everything we thought we knew about fear, about mercy, and about the true difference between something dangerous and something simply misunderstood. But I remember, clearly, the way Thessaly's hardened expression softened just slightly as she listened to him speak. I remember the way Fenric, still grieving his own losses, leaned forward instead of away for the first time since the meeting began. And I remember thinking, as the afternoon light shifted across the chamber walls, that whatever the old records had warned us about, they had missed something essential about the truth standing right in front of us. The Dominion fleet was still out there, gathering itself for another assault. Carvan would not simply accept this defeat and vanish. I understood that even then, even as relief settled uneasily over our capital for the first time in months, the war was not over. But something had changed, something beyond the simple fact of survival. For the first time since this nightmare began, I did not feel like a victim waiting helplessly for destruction to arrive. I felt, for the first time in longer than I could remember, something dangerously close to hope. And as I looked at Daniel Cross sitting calmly among us, discussing logistics and reinforcements with the same casual tone he might use to discuss ordinary weather, I understood that the true battle ahead would not simply be fought with weapons. It would be fought with everything the galaxy thought it already knew about the beasts of Earth, and everything that knowledge had always failed to see. 3 days passed before Carvan made his next move, and in those 3 days, more human ships arrived in our system than I could have imagined possible for a species supposedly without a unified military structure. They came in 2s and 3s, scattered arrivals rather than a single coordinated fleet, each one as mismatched and strange as the first vessels we had encountered. Some were clearly built for war. Others looked like they had been repurposed from entirely different original functions. Cargo haulers and survey ships pressed into service simply because their owners had chosen to answer the call. I spent much of that time aboard wandering home, at Daniel's invitation, learning what I could about these people who had appeared from nowhere to change the course of our war. Grace Whitfield, the woman whose voice I had first heard during the battle, showed me through the ship with patient good humor, answering my endless questions, even when I suspected some of them must have sounded foolish to her. "You keep asking why we do things this way," she said at one point, guiding me past a cramped engineering bay where 2 crew members were arguing cheerfully over a malfunctioning coolant line. "I think you are looking for a strategic explanation that does not really exist. Sometimes the answer really is just that it felt like the right thing to do." "But surely there is risk assessment," I said. "Surely someone calculates whether a mission is worth the potential losses before committing resources." Grace laughed, though not unkindly. "Someone probably should. We are not always great at that part. Ask Daniel about the time he flew straight into a minefield to pull out a stranded transport crew he had never met, against every piece of advice his own navigator gave him." "Did it work?" "It worked," she said. "It also cost us a very expensive engine, and about a month of very uncomfortable travel afterward. But nobody died, and the transport crew got home safe. From where we sit, that is a fair trade most days." It was during this same visit that I met Nathan Pierce, a quieter member of the crew who worked primarily in the ship's small medical bay. He treated several injured Veiltiri civilians who had been caught near the battle's edge, working with careful, practiced hands, despite having no prior experience with our particular biology. When I asked him how he managed to treat patients so different from his own species, he simply shrugged. "Biology has patterns," he said. "You learn the basics, you adapt as you go, and mostly you just try not to make things worse while the body does what bodies do best, which is heal itself given half a chance." He was gentle with every patient who came through his small medical station, speaking softly even to those who could not understand his language, offering comfort through tone and touch when words failed entirely. It struck me, watching him work, how strange it was that the old records had painted this species as something to be feared above all else, when the actual individuals I met seemed to carry as much kindness as caution. That illusion of calm ended abruptly on the morning of the 4th day, when Karvan's fleet, reinforced by additional ships summoned from deeper Dominion territory, launched a second assault on our system. This attack came differently than the first. Karvan had learned from his earlier defeat, adjusting his tactics to account for the unpredictable nature of his new opponents. Rather than approaching in a single tight formation, his ships spread wide, attempting to overwhelm the human fleet through sheer numbers spread across multiple fronts simultaneously. I watched the battle unfold from the command deck of Wandering Home, where Daniel had allowed me to remain as an observer, provided I stayed out of the way of his crew. The tension aboard the ship was palpable, though it manifested differently than I expected. There was no panic, no frantic shouting. Instead, the crew moved with focused, efficient urgency, calling out coordinates and status updates in calm, clipped tones, even as the ship shuddered under incoming fire. "They are trying to split our forces," Grace said, studying the tactical display with narrowed eyes. "Spread us thin across too many fronts at once." "Can we hold?" I asked, unable to keep the worry from my voice. "We can hold," Daniel said, though I noticed the grim set of his jaw as he studied the same display. "But it is going to cost us more than last time. Karvan is not making the same mistakes twice." The battle stretched on for hours, longer and more brutal than the first engagement. I watched human ships take damage that should have destroyed them outright, watched crews continue fighting even as their vessels burned and buckled around them. At one point, a ship I had come to recognize, a modified cargo hauler that had been ferrying supplies between the human fleet's scattered vessels, took a direct hit that tore away nearly a third of its hull. I braced myself for its destruction, certain I was about to witness the death of everyone aboard. Instead, the crew somehow kept it flying, venting atmosphere through emergency seals while continuing to provide covering fire for two smaller vessels caught in the open. "Why do they not retreat?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "That ship should already be lost." "Because retreating means abandoning the ships they are covering," Daniel said simply, "and that is not really something we do." It was during this second, more desperate phase of the battle that Karvan attempted something none of us expected. Rather than continuing the assault indefinitely, he opened a direct channel to Daniel's ship, requesting what he called a formal parley. Daniel accepted, and I watched as Karvan's image appeared on the main screen, his expression carrying the strained composure of a commander who had never before needed to negotiate from a position of weakness. "Captain Cross," Karvan began, his voice carefully measured, "this conflict serves neither of our interests. I am prepared to offer generous terms, territory, resources, technology your people clearly lack. All I ask in return is that you withdraw your forces and allow the Dominion to complete its original objective." Daniel listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When Karvan finished, there was a long pause before he responded. "Let me make sure I understand your offer correctly," Daniel said. "You want us to walk away and let you finish destroying a world full of people who never did anything to you, in exchange for some land and some technology. I am offering you wealth and standing among the greater powers of this galaxy," Karvan said, "something your isolated species has clearly never possessed." "See, that is where you misunderstand us," Daniel said, his tone still calm but carrying an edge I had not heard from him before. "We did not come here for wealth. We did not come here for standing among greater powers. We came here because people were dying, and we happened to be close enough to do something about it. Nothing you can offer changes that math for us." Karvan's composure cracked slightly, frustration bleeding into his voice. "You cannot possibly sustain this level of resistance indefinitely. My reinforcements will continue arriving. Yours are limited, scattered, without proper command structure. Eventually, numbers will overwhelm whatever advantage your unpredictability currently provides." "Maybe," Daniel said, "maybe you outlast us eventually. But here is the thing you still do not understand about us, and I think it is the same thing that got us locked away from the rest of the galaxy in the first place. We do not really calculate whether we can win before deciding whether to fight. We just fight, for as long as it takes, because walking away was never really an option we considered in the first place." "Hudko," The channel went quiet for a long moment. When Carvan spoke again, his voice had lost much of its earlier confidence. "You would sacrifice your entire fleet for a species you had never even met before this week. Every single ship, if that is what it takes," Daniel said, without a trace of hesitation. "That is sort of the whole point of showing up in the first place." Carvan terminated the channel without responding further, and within moments, his fleet resumed its assault with renewed aggression, clearly hoping to break the human resolve through sheer overwhelming force, rather than negotiation. It was during this final, desperate phase of the battle that I witnessed something that would remain with me for the rest of my life. Daniel, watching his own flagship take damage severe enough to threaten its structural integrity, made the decision to lead a direct boarding action against Carvan's command vessel himself, rather than continue trading fire from a distance that clearly favored the Dominion's superior numbers. "That is reckless," I said, watching him prepare alongside a small team of crew members, each of them moving with the same calm urgency I had come to recognize as characteristic of this entire strange, remarkable species. "Probably," Daniel agreed, checking his equipment with practiced efficiency. "But sometimes the fastest way to end a fight is to walk right up to the person causing it and have a direct conversation." I watched him depart aboard a small shuttle, disappearing into the chaos of the ongoing battle, and I found myself gripping the edge of the command console with a tightness that surprised me. Somewhere in the strange, uncertain days since that first beacon had been answered, I had stopped viewing these people as merely useful allies, and had begun, without quite realizing it, to genuinely care whether they survived what came next. Grace remained beside me, her own expression tense despite her attempts to project calm reassurance. "He does this," she said quietly, as though reading my thoughts. "More often than any of us would like. It usually works out." "Usually," I repeated. "Usually," she confirmed. "That is about as much certainty as any of us ever really get." Below us, on the tactical display, I watched the small shuttle carrying Daniel and his team disappear into the looming shadow of Carvan's flagship, and I understood, with a clarity that settled deep into my chest, that whatever happened next would determine far more than simply the outcome of this single battle. It would determine whether the old fear that had kept an entire galaxy at a distance from these people was truly justified, or whether it had simply been the greatest and most tragic misunderstanding in recorded history. The boarding action lasted less time than I expected, though every minute of it felt endless, as I watched fragments of information filter back through the tactical display aboard Wandering Home. Communications from the shuttle crackled with static, brief bursts of activity that told me little beyond the fact that fighting had begun aboard Carvan's flagship. Grace stayed close beside me the entire time, her eyes fixed on the same limited information I could see, her hands occasionally tightening on the edge of the console whenever the signal cut out for longer than a few seconds. I realized, watching her, that despite her earlier calm reassurances, she carried the same fear I did. These people simply carried it differently, tucked away beneath steady hands and measured breathing, rather than allowing it to show openly. "There," she said suddenly, pointing at a shift in the tactical readout. "Carvan's shields just dropped on the central command section. That is where Daniel's team would be heading." I did not fully understand what that meant tactically, but I understood the relief that flooded Grace's expression, and I found myself breathing easier as well, though I could not have explained exactly why I had grown to care so deeply about the fate of people I had known for less than a week. The remaining Dominion fleet, sensing the disruption aboard their flagship, began to waver in their coordinated assault. Ships that had been pressing forward with calculated aggression suddenly hesitated, uncertain how to proceed without clear direction from their command vessel. It was the opening the rest of the human fleet needed, and they pressed their advantage without mercy, driving the disorganized Dominion ships back toward the edge of the system. Nearly 20 minutes after the boarding action began, a final transmission crackled through the command channel. Daniel's voice, tired but unmistakably steady, cut through the static. "This is Cross. Carvan's flagship is secured. Repeat, the flagship is secured. Tell the remaining Dominion ships their commander has agreed to a full withdrawal, effective immediately. The command deck erupted into quiet, relieved activity, crew members exchanging exhausted glances and brief, tired smiles rather than loud celebration. I understood, watching them, that this was not their first battle and likely would not be their last, and that the relief they felt carried the weight of experience rather than simple surprise. Grace turned to me, her expression softening for the first time since the battle began. "Come on," she said. "Let us go make sure our captain is still in one piece." We took a shuttle across to Carvan's flagship, where I witnessed firsthand the aftermath of the boarding action. The command section bore the marks of a struggle, but nothing as severe as I had imagined, and I found Daniel standing near the center of the bridge, overseeing the formal surrender terms with the same tired, patient demeanor he had shown from the very beginning. Carvan stood nearby, guarded but unharmed, his expression a mixture of disbelief and something that looked almost like reluctant respect. "I do not understand you," Carvan said, watching Daniel as he coordinated the withdrawal terms with quiet efficiency. "Your species should not exist the way you exist. Every calculation says a force as small and disorganized as yours should have been destroyed within the first hour of this conflict." "You keep saying that," Daniel replied, not unkindly. "Maybe the problem is not with us. Maybe the problem is that your calculations were built around fighting people who think like you do." "The rest of the galaxy fears you for good reason," Carvan said. "Your history is filled with violence." "So is yours," Daniel said simply. "The difference is that when we finally decided violence was not the answer anymore, we decided to use everything we learned about fighting to protect people instead of conquering them. That is a distinction your survey team apparently missed." Carvan had no response to that, and within the hour, his fleet began withdrawing from our system entirely, leaving behind wreckage and a war that had, against every expectation, come to an end far sooner than anyone could have predicted. I stood beside Daniel as we watched the last Dominion ships vanish into the darkness beyond our system's edge, and I found myself struggling to process everything that had happened in the span of a single week. Our world, which had faced certain destruction, now stood safe, protected by a species the entire galaxy had spent generations warning everyone to avoid. "What happens now?" I asked quietly. Daniel considered the question for a long moment before answering. "Now you rebuild. Now your people figure out how to move forward from everything that happened here, and hopefully never have to face something like this again." "And your fleet?" "We will stay a little while longer, help however we can with recovery efforts, then most of us will move on to wherever the next call for help happens to come from," he said. "That is sort of the pattern for us. We do not really settle in one place for long." I thought about the old warnings sealed in our archives, the fear that had shaped generations of understanding about this species, and I found myself unable to reconcile those ancient fears with the reality standing in front of me. This man, exhausted from battle, had risked everything, not for conquest or reward, but simply because someone had asked for help. "I do not understand," I said finally. "Your people were locked away, feared, avoided entirely by the rest of known space. And yet the first thing you did, the very first thing, when given the chance, was risk everything to save strangers who had been taught their entire lives to fear you." Daniel turned to look at me, and for the first time since we had met, I saw something genuinely vulnerable behind his tired eyes. "I think that is the part everyone always gets wrong about us," he said. "They study our history. They see the wars, the mistakes, all the ugly parts of what we have done to each other over the centuries, and they decide that is the whole story. But nobody ever seems to notice the other part. Every single time something truly terrible happens, somewhere, to someone, there is always somebody willing to run straight toward the danger instead of away from it. That has always been true of us too. The galaxy just never stuck around long enough to see it." I stood quietly beside him, watching the wreckage of the battle slowly clear from our skies, and I thought about Thessaly's words from days earlier, about asking for something the galaxy had spent a long time trying to forget existed at all. "They quarantined you to protect everyone else," I said slowly, understanding settling over me with a weight I had not expected. But nobody considered that one day, someone might desperately need exactly what they were so afraid of. That is about the shape of it, Daniel agreed. Funny thing about mercy, sometimes it does not look gentle at all. Sometimes it looks exactly like the thing everybody warned you to be afraid of, showing up anyway, because somebody needed saving and nobody else was willing to come. We returned to the surface together, where Thessaly and the rest of the council waited to formally thank the humans for their assistance, and to begin the long, complicated process of establishing a genuine relationship between our two peoples, one built on something far more honest than the ancient fear that had kept us apart for so long. In the weeks that followed, as our world slowly rebuilt itself and the human fleet remained to assist with recovery efforts, I spent considerable time speaking with Daniel, Grace, Nathan, and the rest of the crew aboard Wandering Home, learning as much as I could about the true nature of the people the galaxy had chosen to fear rather than understand. I learned that Nathan had lost family members in conflicts back on his own homeworld, conflicts that had shaped his gentle, careful approach to healing others regardless of species. I learned that Grace had joined the crew after her own colony had faced destruction with no one willing to answer their call for help. Experience that had shaped her fierce commitment to never letting that happen to anyone else if she could help it. I learned that Daniel himself carried scars, both visible and otherwise, from a lifetime of answering calls that others had ignored. None of them spoke of themselves as heroes. None of them seemed to believe they deserved special recognition for what they had done. They simply seemed to view their actions as the natural, obvious response to witnessing someone in need. A perspective so foreign to the calculated, self-protective instincts of most galactic civilizations that it had apparently terrified an entire survey team generations earlier into recommending total isolation. On the day the human fleet finally prepared to depart, having stayed long enough to ensure our world's recovery was well underway, I found myself standing beside Daniel one final time, watching preparations unfold around the docking bay. "Will you answer if we call again?" I asked, though some part of me already knew the answer. "Every single time," he said, without hesitation. "That is not really something we know how to stop doing. Even though you were never truly welcomed by the rest of the galaxy, even though most worlds still fear you the same way mine once did." Daniel considered the question, looking out across the horizon of our world, at cities slowly rebuilding, at people walking freely, beneath a sky that no longer threatened them with destruction. "Especially because of that," he said finally, "somebody has to be willing to answer, even when nobody else will, even when the ones asking for help were taught their whole lives to be afraid of exactly who might show up." I thought about my own fear, weeks earlier, sending that ancient beacon into the darkness with no real hope of an answer, expecting silence, or at worst, something even more terrible arriving in response to our desperate call. I thought about the stars we had begged for mercy, and the silence that had answered every previous plea we had ever sent, and I thought about what had actually arrived instead. Not gods, not distant, indifferent powers too far removed from our suffering to care. Something far more complicated, far more human, in every sense of that word I was only beginning to understand. They had been called beasts by a galaxy too frightened to look closer, too comfortable in its calculated fears, to ever consider what might happen if that fear was simply, tragically wrong. As Wandering Home lifted away from our world, carrying Daniel, Grace, Nathan, and the rest of their strange, remarkable crew toward whatever distress call would need them next, I stood watching until the ship disappeared entirely into the vast darkness above. We had begged the stars for mercy, certain that mercy, if it existed at all, would come wrapped in something gentle, something safe, something easy to understand. Instead, mercy had arrived looking exactly like everything we had once feared most, proving that the greatest kindness in the entire galaxy had been hiding, all along, inside the very beasts everyone else had been too afraid to ever truly know.